4 years, the protagonist had endured the relentless scrutiny and harassment of Eleanor Winters, the iron-fisted president of the Riverbend HOA. She had a knack for finding fault in the most insignificant details: chipped paint on his mailbox, the placement of his garden gnomes, the shade of blue he had chosen for his shutters. Every week, without fail, a new violation notice would appear in his mailbox, each one more absurd than the last. At first, he had dismissed it as nothing more than the meddling of an overzealous woman with too much time on her hands, but over time, the harassment took a toll. It wasn't just about aesthetics or rules. Eleanor had made it personal. She watched his every move, scouring his property for the tiniest infractions, and when he dared to challenge her authority at HOA meetings, she made it clear that he was not welcome in her community. His neighbors, fearing her wrath, looked away, pretending not to notice the way he was being targeted. The Thompson family had tried to stand up to her once, questioning a sudden hike in HOA fees, only to find themselves drowning in fines and legal threats until they were forced to sell their home. The message was clear: resistance was futile. But despite the warnings, despite the quiet terror that gripped the neighborhood, he refused to back down. This was his home, his sanctuary, the place he had built with Sarah, the love of his life. No HOA president, no matter how ruthless, was going to take that away from him. Then, one fateful morning, everything changed. He awoke to the distant sound of heavy machinery, the low, guttural growl of an excavator rolling into his front yard. At first, he thought there had been some mistake, perhaps roadwork or a neighbor's renovation project, but as he stepped outside, the full horror of the situation became clear. His home, the very heart of his memories, was being torn down before his eyes. A demolition crew, hired under dubious authority, was already at work, their machines clawing through wood and brick as if they were nothing more than debris. He ran toward them, shouting, waving his arms, demanding answers, but the workers ignored him, their orders clear and unwavering. Desperation clawed at his chest as he searched for anyone who could stop this madness, but then he saw her, Eleanor Winters, standing at the edge of the property with a smug smirk on her face, arms crossed in triumph. "It's for the good of the community," she had the audacity to say, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. He barely heard her. His ears were filled with the sounds of destruction, of a lifetime being reduced to rubble. It wasn't just a house, it was a monument to Sarah, a place where laughter had once echoed in the halls, where whispered secrets had been shared beneath warm blankets, where love had lived and breathed in every brick and beam. And now it was gone. Stolen from him by a woman who saw nothing but profit in its place. The days that followed were a blur of grief and rage. He pored over every legal document, every notice he had ever received from the HOA, searching for an explanation. What he found was worse than he had imagined. Eleanor hadn't acted out of mere malice. She had been working toward this moment for years. Her husband, Robert Winters, was a real estate developer with grand visions of luxury condominiums lining the riverfront, and his land acquisition plans had one glaring obstacle: the protagonist's home. The HOA's endless citations, the constant fines, the deliberate isolation, it had all been a calculated effort to push him out. But when he refused to budge, Eleanor had taken matters into her own hands. She had falsified HOA documents, manipulated zoning regulations, and used her iron grip over the neighborhood to orchestrate his downfall. His house had been razed not because of some violation, but because it was in the way. The knowledge sent a fresh wave of fury through him. He had been a fool to think this was just about gnomes and mailboxes. This was about power, control, greed. And Eleanor had wielded all three without a second thought. But she had made one crucial mistake: she hadn't underestimated him. Though his home lay in ruins, his spirit was far from broken. He had lost nearly everything, but there was one person who could help him fight back: his brother, James. The two had always been close, but their lives had taken vastly different paths. While he had built his life around Sarah and their quiet riverside home, James had climbed the ranks of the legal world, earning a reputation as a formidable force in the courtroom. And now, fate had handed him a weapon he never expected to use. James had just been sworn in as Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. When he told his brother what had happened, the normally composed and diplomatic James was livid. He wasted no time in launching a full-scale legal assault on Eleanor and the HOA, digging into their records, scrutinizing every questionable decision they had made. What he found was damning. Eleanor had not only falsified documents to justify the demolition, but she had also embezzled HOA funds for years, funneling money into her husband's development projects while keeping homeowners under her thumb. It was a house of cards, built on lies and fraud, and James was determined to bring it crashing down. But he wasn't the only one. Inspired by the protagonist's defiance, the once fearful neighbors began stepping forward, each with their own stories of Eleanor's tyranny. The Thompson family, the Callahans, even the quiet widow on the corner who had never spoken up before, one by one, they broke their silence. The community that had once been paralyzed by fear was finding its voice. And together, they were going to take Eleanor down. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as the trial against Eleanor Winters began. The evidence James had gathered was overwhelming. Falsified documents, bank statements showing misappropriated funds, testimonies from homeowners who had suffered under her reign. Eleanor sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her usual air of superiority now replaced with cold, silent dread. As the prosecution laid out its case, exposing her corruption for all to see, she barely flinched. But when Robert Winters took the stand, delivering the final blow, her mask cracked. He had turned against her. Whether out of guilt or a desperate attempt to salvage his own reputation, he testified against his wife, revealing her role in manipulating HOA rules to serve their personal interests. The moment his words left his lips, Eleanor's composure shattered. Gone was the unshakable queen of the HOA. In her place sat a woman who had lost everything: her power, her influence, even the loyalty of her own husband. The jury's verdict was swift. Guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful property seizure. The sentence was harsher than anyone expected: 20 years in prison and full restitution to the victims of her schemes. The gavel came down with a final, decisive thud, and just like that, Eleanor Winters, the woman who had ruled over Riverbend with an iron fist, was led away in handcuffs, her reign of terror finally over. But for the protagonist, the true victory wasn't just Eleanor's downfall. It was the sight of his community, once divided by fear, now standing together, stronger than ever. And as they began the work of rebuilding, not just his home, but the very fabric of their neighborhood, he knew that Sarah would have been proud. Eleanor Winters had spent years tightening her grip over Riverbend, ruling with an iron fist through manipulation, intimidation, and corruption. But now, everything she had built, her influence, her wealth, her carefully constructed facade, had crumbled to dust. Convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, she had been sentenced to 20 years in prison, a stunning downfall for a woman who once held unchecked power over an entire community. But if the people of Riverbend thought they had seen the last of Eleanor's wrath, they were wrong. Even in her final days of freedom, she refused to accept defeat. With her assets frozen, her husband divorcing her, and her name forever tarnished, Eleanor had nothing left to lose, and that made her more dangerous than ever. In a last, desperate act of vengeance, she set her sights on the protagonist once more. If she couldn't control Riverbend, if she couldn't have her way, then she would make sure he suffered just as she had. And so, under the cover of darkness, she slipped through the shadows toward the construction site of his new home. With trembling hands, she doused the wooden framework with gasoline, the sharp fumes burning her nostrils as she worked. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, not from fear, but from rage. This was his fault. He had turned the neighborhood against her. He had destroyed everything she had built. The flick of a lighter sparked a small flame, and as she prepared to send it all up in smoke, she whispered a single venomous curse under her breath. He doesn't deserve to win. But just as she prepared to let the fire consume everything, the wail of police sirens split the night air, their flashing red and blue lights painting her final act of destruction in an eerie, flickering glow. The officers descended upon the scene in an instant, their commands sharp and unyielding. "Drop it! Hands where we can see them!" Eleanor froze for only a moment before turning to run, but there was nowhere to go. The site was fenced off, the police had the exits covered, and before she could take another step, strong hands grabbed her arms, forcing her to the ground. The lighter clattered against the pavement, harmless now, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. "You're under arrest for attempted arson," an officer informed her as he snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. The protagonist arrived moments later, breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took in the scene. His half-built home, soaked in gasoline, stood on the brink of destruction, saved only by sheer luck and the swift intervention of the police. And there, kneeling on the ground in handcuffs, was Eleanor Winters, her once imposing presence reduced to a pitiful, desperate figure. He expected her to lash out, to scream in fury, but instead, she simply lowered her head, her body sagging in defeat. It was over. This time, there would be no schemes, no loopholes, no power plays. Eleanor had dug her own grave, and the final nail had just been hammered into the coffin. As she was loaded into the back of the squad car, her eyes met his through the window, but there was no malice left, only a hollow emptiness, the last embers of a fire that had burned too hot for too long. With Eleanor officially behind bars, the people of Riverbend wasted no time in undoing the damage she had wrought upon their community. The corrupt HOA she had once ruled with an iron fist was swiftly dismantled, and in its place, The residents worked together to form a new, more democratic neighborhood charter, one built on fairness, respect, and transparency. No longer would a single person hold unchecked power over the lives of others. No longer would fear dictate their actions. The community that had once been fractured by Eleanor's tyranny was now bound together by a shared determination to never let history repeat itself. But for the protagonist, the true journey of healing lay in rebuilding his home, the home that had been taken from him, the home where his memories of Sarah had lived. It wasn't just about putting up walls and laying bricks, it was about restoring a piece of his heart, about reclaiming what had been stolen. And he wasn't alone. The very people who had once been too afraid to stand against Eleanor now stood beside him, hammering nails, painting walls, planting gardens. Even Robert Winters, Eleanor's estranged husband, stepped forward, offering financial support as a form of redemption. "I should have stopped her," Robert admitted one evening, watching as construction workers raised the frame of the new house. "I let it go too far. This is the least I can do." The protagonist didn't forgive him immediately. Wounds like these didn't heal overnight, but he accepted the gesture. After all, this wasn't just about rebuilding a house. It was about rebuilding a community. As the final touches were placed on the protagonist's new home, the community came together for one last act of healing. In the center of the garden, where Sarah had once spent countless afternoons tending to her flowers, they planted a new rose garden in her memory. Each neighbor contributed something, a handful of seeds, a bag of soil, a small plaque with her name etched into it. And at the heart of the garden, they placed a stone bench, engraved with a simple but powerful message: "In loving memory of Sarah, a place of love, a place of hope." The protagonist ran his fingers over the smooth stone, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep within his chest. Sarah had always believed in the power of community, in kindness, in standing together against adversity. And though she was gone, her spirit lived on in the people who had fought beside him, in the home that had been rebuilt, in the roses that would bloom year after year. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Months passed, and life in Riverbend settled into a new normal. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined the neighborhood. The protagonist's home stood tall once more. The fear that had once gripped the community had been replaced with resilience, and Eleanor Winters was nothing more than a distant memory, a cautionary tale of power gone unchecked. But then, one day, an envelope arrived in the mail. The return address read State Correctional Facility. His breath hitched as he opened it, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in precise, controlled handwriting. It was a letter from Eleanor. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know, I see it now. I see what I've done. I thought power meant control. I thought winning meant making others lose. But I lost everything in the end. And for what? A house I never lived in? A title that means nothing now? I don't ask for redemption, but I wanted you to know that I understand. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. It didn't erase what she had done. It didn't change the past. But perhaps in some small way, it meant that she, too, was finally free of the monster she had become. The letter from Eleanor remained tucked away in the protagonist's drawer, an artifact of a battle that had forever changed the landscape of Riverbend. Life, however, moved forward. The once strict and oppressive HOA was now a relic of the past, replaced by a homeowners association built on fairness and collective decision-making. The residents, once bound by fear and silent compliance, now found themselves actively engaged in shaping the future of their neighborhood. Monthly meetings were no longer tense, authoritarian gatherings where Eleanor's word was law. Instead, they became forums for discussion, where every voice mattered. People who had once lived in isolation, afraid to even acknowledge each other's struggles, now came together in celebration and solidarity. Barbecues were held in front yards, children played freely in the streets without fear of reprimands over trivial violations, and the weight of Eleanor's tyranny faded into nothing more than an unpleasant memory. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Riverbend had been given a second chance, and this time, they refused to squander it. The protagonist watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing that while the scars of the past might never fully fade, they had become reminders of a hard-fought victory. One of the most symbolic moments of Riverbend's renewal came when the Thompson family returned. Years ago, they had been among the first to suffer under Eleanor's rule, their home practically stolen from them through excessive fines and legal threats. Forced to sell and relocate, They had left behind more than just a house, they had left behind a dream. But with Eleanor gone and her fraudulent dealings exposed, many of her previous actions were overturned in court, including the forced sale of the Thompsons' home. The protagonist was there the day they stepped back onto their old property, their eyes filled with disbelief and cautious hope. "I never thought we'd see this place again," Mr. Thompson admitted, his voice thick with emotion as he ran a hand along the porch railing. "We fought so hard, and for so long, it felt like we lost." His wife nodded, blinking away tears. "But we didn't," she whispered. "We're home." The community rallied around them, helping them move in, restoring their garden, and welcoming them back with open arms. It was more than just reclaiming a house. It was a symbol that justice had truly prevailed. Despite everything, the protagonist couldn't shake the weight of Eleanor's letter. It wasn't that he forgave her. How could he, after all the pain she had caused? But there was something unsettling about her words, something that made him wonder if, in the end, she had truly understood the devastation she had wrought. And so, on a quiet afternoon, he found himself driving to the state correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. He wasn't sure why he was there or what he expected to find, but when Eleanor was brought into the visitation room, he was struck by how much she had changed. The imperious, meticulously groomed woman who had once lorded over Riverbend was gone. In her place was someone smaller, quieter, stripped of the power that had once defined her. She sat across from him, hands folded, eyes tired but clear. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Her voice was softer than he remembered, devoid of its usual venom. He studied her, searching for deception, but found none. "I wasn't sure either." Eleanor exhaled slowly, nodding. "I ruined my life," she admitted. "And I nearly ruined yours. I see that now." He could have responded with anger, with the weight of all she had done to him, but instead he simply asked, "Why?" A bitter smile crossed her lips. "Because I was afraid of losing. I thought power meant control. I thought if I could just keep everything in its place, keep everyone in line, I could stop change from coming. But change came anyway. And I lost everything because of it." She looked down at her hands. "I know an apology won't fix what I did. But for what it's worth, I am sorry." The protagonist didn't forgive her, not entirely, but he did recognize something genuine in her regret. And that was Inug. The seasons changed, and with them, so did the protagonist's home. The new house was finished, standing proudly in the very spot where the old one had once been. But even with all the careful reconstruction, there was still something missing. Something that no amount of brick and wood could replace. And so, with the help of his neighbors, he began the final project, the restoration of Sarah's garden. The rose garden had already been planted in her honor, but there was one last piece of the past he wanted to bring back, the old wooden swing that had once hung from the large oak tree in the backyard. It had been Sarah's favorite place, a quiet sanctuary where she would sit and read, watching the river flow by. When the original house had been destroyed, the swing had been lost, but now, the community came together once more to build a new one.